Hello. So this is interesting, isn't it? This new isolated existence. I mean, this is my space. I never meant it to be some presentation station, and yet here we are, feeling a little bit awkward, to be honest. But more importantly, you, how are you holding up? Are you worried and finding it hard to concentrate? Are you angry at the injustice of it? Do you just feel sad about it all? Or are you maybe busy reinventing yourself with yoga and sourdough, pivoting your startup while homeschooling your children into a modern version of the Von Trapp family? And while that's all happening, how's work? Your colleagues, your boss? Is this the new normal? Or is the new normal what happens next after we start reopening? And how much back to normal will we get really? Either way, things change and we have to try and adapt, right? I mean, we've made it so far. I'm sitting here talking, you're there kindly watching, but then what? We don't want to just survive, right? We want a better future, but do we have any control over it? The starting point is stress and how we react to it. On one hand, stress can drive us to do something in order to survive. It served us well during our evolution. On the other, too much stress over time can have a dangerous impact. Survival can be about ensuring a stable environment, like staying inside the cave, and it's also about risking the volatility of the outside for better prospects. So we have both sides, the regressive side and the progressive side. It requires reaction and it requires effort. We want to make sure we're comfy in front of the telly, but we also want to risk our social distancing at the supermarket, hunting for something better than crisps, which seem to be the only vegetable we have left in the house. Just an example. Stressful, isn't it? And motivating. However, especially when we have little control and the threat doesn't go away, over time the stress stays and it slowly changes our brain. Here's how survival mode works for individuals. We either erupt, implode, or stay. Let's unpack it. It's a function of the level of stress and how long it lasts. People react to stress in a variety of different ways. So you feel some stress, and then you have reactions that you tend to have depending on how you were brought up and your genes and all sorts of other factors. And as a result of how you react, you also over time feel things. Most famously, fight, flight, freeze, fawn are our instinctive reaction to stressful situations. Fawn is the less known of the four, and what it means is trying to get over the stress and over the situation by people pleasing and overperforming in order to manage things. All those reactions can be useful for our survival, but a combination of high stress over time can be too much for our resilience. And then that leads to a situation known as trauma. Now, that means that the normal feelings we might have, for example, a fight reaction, maybe accompanied by anger, those feelings and those reactions starts being quite rigid and out of control, and we are trapped in survival mode to a degree, and um, stress then tends to trigger those responses in a rigid, negative, and unhelpful way. And the feelings get stronger. And it's a vicious cycle between how you feel and how you react, and how stressful things become. Organizations, I would argue, actually have very similar patterns because organizations are made of people. So in the survival mode organization, everything is critical and urgent. Everything is about this day, the next hour, the next week. There's a control focus. You're being micromanaged. You're trying to control everything. You're playing it safe. People say things like, we have to stick to our knitting. And there's this conservation mentality, which sometimes can be a good thing, but if we are constantly trying to protect things, we may not be able to really grow and change. There is a lot of resistance to change in a survival mode organization. It tends to be quite reactive. And there's an overall short-termism. It's about making it to the end of the week. And we've all been there, organizations where we feel we want to make it safely to the end of the day. Over time, while all those mechanisms can help an organization survive and can be helpful in crisis, they might create what I call the post-traumatic organization. And the post-traumatic organization is uncreative and rigid and brittle and toxic and not a very nice place to work at. Jon Berry, who wrote a very interesting book about the Great Influenza of 1918, says the biggest challenge for an emergency manager is to get the person who makes a decision to do so rationally rather than whatever they see as their political advantage or instinctive reaction that may or may not be correct. And if you think about it, you'll probably realize that that has been your situation over the last couple of weeks, unless you have wonderful managers who never act instinctively and are always, have grace under pressure. But also, it could be the question of what kind of a boss are you to yourself? So how do organizations try to prepare typically? Typically, it's about risk, contingency, and continuity. You try to identify the sources of risk, make some contingency plans, and then assure the continuity of the business. The classic risk management approach says identify threats, assess vulnerability, determine risk, then identify ways to reduce the risk, and prioritize reduction measures because you can't, spend an endless amount of resources. Even the slightly more progressive approach of crisis management still talks about identifying types of crises, determining the impact they may have on your business, consider the actions you'll need to take, decide who will be involved in the actions, develop plans, train the people, and then you revisit and update the plans. Again, you'll notice the focus of both those approaches is community. It's a survival first approach, and it tends to focus on things like liquidity, key KPIs, stakeholder confidence, and supply chains resilience. All those things are incredibly important. You need to make sure they are right the first time. And in that sense, this quote from David Tilston of the Institute for Turnaround, get a 13-week rolling cash flow forecast started as soon as possible, ideally this week, and updated weekly. Of course, you have to do that. But the issue is that all those things bring you to the continuity stage. And they don't take you beyond that stage, especially if the crisis is not a crisis you necessarily were prepared for, and the changes in the environment are quite rapid. And not only that, but if you stay on those things, stuck on those things for too long, then you risk being stuck in survival mode. So what is the beyond survival? How do we shift to a turnaround and growth mindset? Here's more advice from the Institute for Turnaround. Crisis management with a turnaround focus. 1. Take stock of the situation and regularly evaluate. 2. Maintain or increase the communications flow to key stakeholders. 3. Closely manage your cash flow as it's the lifeblood of the business. So far, it's very familiar. It's the traditional approach to crisis management. 4. Ensure your supply chain is resilient and have a contingency plan, of course. But then something interesting is happening. 5. Adapt your operating model, including how senior management work. Hmm, you can't really have a contingency plan for a lot of that. 6, think about the long-term position and start to put a strategy in place. And in the article where the IFT is giving this advice, Nina Warwick unpacks those stages 5 and 6, and she raises some questions. Very good questions they are. Work out what sets you apart from your competition. What is different about how you do business? What is different about how you value your clients, and why would they work with you? What is your unique selling point? And at this point, I remember myself thinking, this is very familiar. Hang on a minute. This is strategy. This is strategy in the classic sense, like Rummell's kernel, a recent but very elegant definition of strategy: diagnosis of challenge, guiding policy for dealing with it, and coherent actions that execute this policy. I sometimes call it think, plan, and act. And of course, it's not a linear process. It's actually a loop. Think, plan, act. After you execute your policy, you test things, you learn from that, and you take it back into your next thinking process. And that shape of strategy actually repeats across almost any strategic model you can think about. The engineering process works that way: design thinking, lean startups, agile development, Six Sigma, IBM's design thinking loop, user-centered design, and even military strategy models like Dada and UDA. So was it strategy all along? If we look at two models of crisis management, we'll see that the three phases of crisis management, for example, are the diagnosis of the impending trouble or the danger signals, choosing appropriate turnaround strategy, implementation of the change process, and its monitoring. This is think, plan, act again. And business continuity planning lifecycle is again analysis, design, implementation, then testing, maintenance, and going back to analysis. So if strategic thinking is actually embedded into crisis management, maybe by helping strategic thinking remain a part of the process, we can then also move beyond survival mode into a more growth-oriented mode and something that is more adaptive. So how do we do it? Here are some tools. The first thing to keep in mind is that it's not a question of time. We've all been there, a situation where there's a crisis and strategy is the first thing gets thrown out the window because there's no time. Well, remember those military strategy models? UDA, the one at the bottom, observe, orient, decide, and act, is a model that was developed by observing how jet fighter pilots think during a dogfight in the sky. If they have time for strategy, you have time for strategy, and everybody should have time for strategy. One useful tool to think about is the traps and tracks tool from cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea here is that a trap works that way. There's a trigger and a response to the trigger that leads to an avoidance pattern. So, for example, I'm bored in the house and I'm in the house bored. And because I'm bored, my response is I walk to the fridge and I start eating it top to bottom. And this is my avoidance pattern. Because I was bored, it made me think about how worried I am, and then I had to eat, and comfort eating is my avoidance pattern. You try to replace that trap with a track. So yes, I'm bored, that's my trigger, but before I start worrying and walk to the fridge, I grab a book and read a chapter or a couple of pages, or I do some exercise. In other words, I lead myself by changing the response to the trigger, the immediate response, and being more mindful to an alternative coping mechanism. And I think Organizations can do that too. We all know our triggers. We all know what makes the organization nervous. And we all know what the knee-jerk response tends to be. And we can try and see if there are alternative strategies that are more constructive. Here's another classic strategy tool. This is Ome's 3 C's. He says in every strategic situation, keep in mind the 3 C's: company, customer, and competition. In my build on one model, I talk about company, which can also be brand or product, customer, which can be any type of audience, and context, which includes competition, category, and culture. Now, you still need to think of those dimensions. Those are still the dimensions. The win conditions of business, and especially marketing, stay the same win conditions. For company is to have integrity of systems, of behaviors, and of purpose. For customers, it's about having relevance. The company wants to get as close as it can to understanding the customer. And the win condition for context is to be different or to be distinctive, to stand out from the rest, whether it's from the rest of the competition or the whole category, or just making a cultural impact. And you want to get as distinctive as you can and as further away from the competition and as close to your customers. That is a very well-known model. What happens to that in a crisis? Well, if I have to think about it, I would give the following advice. For company, think about the role you can take now and your long-term commitments and how you balance those two things. Try to increase the level of collaboration and feedback loops, the frequency and efficiency in which they happen. That will really help you notice changes and figure out solutions. And that is still possible. You can do that by having, a group Zoom call every other day. In terms of your customer or any kind of audience, I think the most important thing is to increase your level of empathy. You need to understand that the situation has changed and their needs may have changed with that. Maybe you need to try and identify any new needs you can help with, but not just as a salesperson. Try to also think about it like a caretaker, a custodian, or a nurse. Be gentle, be mindful. Maybe the ways you used to sell or used to talk to them are no longer the ways you should do it now. Maybe the timing is wrong. Be mindful, be tactful. Finally, in terms of context, that's a huge area, and I think there's so much information out there. It's very important that we select our sources very carefully, sometimes brutally, and we should also consider not just what changes, but also what remains. There's a great quote from Jeff Bezos, and he says, I very frequently get the question, what's going to change in the next 10 years? And that is a very interesting question. It's a very common one. I almost never get the question, what's not going to change in the next 10 years? And I submit to you that second question is actually the more important of the two, because you can build a business strategy around things that are stable in time. So no matter what sector you are and how much you've been disrupted by the pandemic, there are still things that have remained unchanged and you can build your strategy around. We need to remember we can't control everything. So some things will feel like a roller coaster, where all you can do is try to grab on to the cart and hope that it stays on the rails. Some things will be more like a chariot, where you really need to control those wild horses and keep them in place and keep everything under very tight control. But more often than not, I believe it will be the combination of the two. Like surfing, you're riding this huge volatile wave, and there are a lot of things that are out of your control, but there are some things you can do in order to make the most of that situation. And keep in mind that what remains unchanged is as important as what changes. The overall message is that staying strategic in a crisis is a sign of resilience. Being strategic is being resilient to a degree, because it has so many qualities that are important for our resilience. You have to have a positive attitude, to be optimistic, you have to regulate your emotions, you have to see failure as helpful feedback. And the nice thing is that even if you artificially make yourself more strategic in a crisis, it'll gently nudge you towards that healthier coping mechanism. And the last advice is to always remember to put your own mask first. Help yourself so you can help others. Thank you for listening. I hope you find it helpful and let me know what you think. In the meantime, stay safe.